Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm guessing yes, since I just get texts from all of you. Great. So my name is Elizabeth Bach. I am a what's called a postdoctoral research fellow. I have a PhD. I earned that in 2014, so I'm still pretty young to the game. And in this position, I am the executive director for something called the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. I'm based at Colorado State University in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And my job is I work with soil ecologists and biodiversity scientists from around the world focused on soils and the organisms that live beneath our feet. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I think is a super exciting world of soil organisms. And hopefully you all can ask questions and have input. I've tried to make this pretty interactive. So I'm going to mention now, and I may mention it again as more people hop on. If you have questions during the presentation, or if your students have questions, please go ahead and type them in. I may not answer them immediately. I may wait to finish a thought and then come back around to them, but it may be easier for you guys to go ahead and send your question my way, and then I'll answer it as it fits in. But I've tried to make the presentation flexible so we can do lots of questions and answers. And if I do miss your question and I don't seem to be coming back to it, feel free to type it in again. So to get started, I have some questions for all of you in the audience. When you see the word dirt, what do you think about? Okay, I hear soil, microbes, earth crust. Okay, great. I got one comment about poor signal. Is anybody else having technical problems? Okay. If you do have tech problems, let me know. I'm guessing it may have been on that person's end. Okay, so microbes, soil, earth crust. Any other thoughts with dirt? Okay. I'm going to move on to the next page. Plants, sources for biodiversity, bugs. That's one of my favorites, bugs. Lots of bugs in the dirt. Cool. All right, so the next word I have for you is going to be a little bit of a curveball, and that is soil. So what do you think about with the word soil? Does it make you think of anything different than the word dirt does? Gardening. Okay. Yeah, I like that. Water. Yeah. Soil's a good way to, it stores a lot of water. It absorbs a lot of water. And it filters water, keeps it clean. Sponginess. All right, that goes with the water too. Yep, yep. All right. If you have more thoughts, hop in. Where plants can grow, which helps the food chain develop. Yeah, soil's the support system for plants, which are often considered, the base of the food chain, the support system for all those animals and birds and insects that live above ground. So what I'm trying to get at here is life. Yay, this is the perfect lead-in. Is what is the difference between dirt and soil? We often think of them somewhat synonymously, or they're the same thing, but they actually aren't. And the key difference, honestly, is life, this last answer we got in the chat. So dirt, if you look up the definition, really means dust or debris, something that you'd want to clean out of somewhere. And soil is actually something that supports life. Often that's described as being able to support plant life. But it also supports a tremendous amount of life below ground. And we often don't think about it because we just walk on it or brush it off. Can dirt be soil? This is a great question. And so actually, the answer is no. Soil is different from dirt, and there are some people who get very offended when you call soil dirt, and the difference is this ability to support life. So in dirt usually has a connotation of it's unwanted, it's dirty, it's no good, and you can't grow anything that is technically just dirt, whereas soil you can grow things. And so soil is technically different from dirt. Now, in our conversations, usually people understand what you mean when you say dirt and soil, but when scientists are speaking about it, they're often very careful to make sure that they're referring to soil and not to dirt in that sense. So yeah, so that's the big take home. If you remember one thing from this hour, I hope that you remember soil has life in it, and technically dirt doesn't. So soil is home to actually more than 25% of all the biodiversity on Earth. Some estimates go up to 30%, but definitely more than 25%. And it includes organisms from all the domains of life, if you've talked about those in your classes. So that includes prokaryotes like archaea and bacteria, as well as eukaryotes, which are all the things that we think about in terms of plants and animals and fungi and all of that stuff. So we have a question here. Is there a way to soak up so many nutrients that it becomes dirt? Okay, so this is a good question here. So the difference, technically nutrients aren't living organisms. It's usually compounds like nitrogen and phosphorus. That's usually what we mean when we talk about nutrients. And so it's possible for dirt to have nutrients, but if it doesn't have the right balance or it can't hold water, it may not be able to support life. It's also true that sometimes if we add a lot of nutrients, or say if soils that are near like a sulfur hot spring or something like that that have a lot of naturally occurring nutrients in it, there's very little life that can grow in it. But what we've found as scientists is that often there really is life living in some sort across all these conditions. So a really good question about soils and soil biodiversity is how can we manage it for systems that can grow food or house wildlife and nature. And hopefully we'll get to talk about some of all of these things. So if I haven't, as the presentation goes on, if you want to know more, ask another question. So soils just support a tremendous amount of life. And the big reason is because soils are actually very complex. If you think about like the spatial structure of a soil, there's all these particles, sand and clay and silt, and some of those particles are charged and some of them aren't, and then there's water flowing through holes and there's air, and it creates a lot of different habitats for things to live in. So part of the reason soil supports so much biodiversity is because there's a lot of different habitats that organisms can live in within the soil. So something that I've been involved in and that the Global Soil Biodiversity has been involved in is creating a global soil biodiversity atlas. So this atlas was released in 2016. We have a big book copy of it just to kind of show you all. So teachers, if you would like to have a book version of this for your class, you can order it from the EU bookshop. I put the link here. I'll try and see if Deb can send the link out to all of you folks directly. The print copies cost about $28 US plus shipping. This was a partnership with our colleagues at the European Union, so it was printed in Luxembourg, so they have to mail it over to the US or to North America. So that's the approximate cost. However, you can download a PDF copy of this atlas online for free, also from the EU bookshop, or you can see this new website that we've put together to present all that information, and that's what I'm going to spend the next kind of block of time talking about. So give me a second. I'm going to try and pull this up so that you all can see it. Maybe it's not going to work. I was just realizing there's another way that we can make this work. Okay, we're going to do it this way so we get there faster. So this is what the website looks like, and the address is atlas.globalsoilbiodiversity.org. Any of you can log on and take a look at this website. We just got it up and running last fall. There's also links here to that PDF copy or to the order for the print copy. If you're interested, you can get to it this way as well. As I mentioned, this was a joint venture between scientists around the world. We had scientists from all different, I guess, all 6 continents, although we have scientists that work in Antarctica that were also involved in the project, and between the GSBI and our European Commission Joint Research Center colleagues. And the atlas, I'm going to just highlight some of the cool information you can find there. We have 8 chapters. The first chapter is talking about the soil habitat. So what I mentioned when I was talking about how soils have lots of different habitats, different structures, water, air, gas, all of that. You can learn more about that in our soil habitat chapter. Chapter 2 looks at the diversity of soil organisms, and that's what I'm going to mostly focus on today, so we'll come back to it. But the atlas also looks into things like the geographical and temporal distribution of soil biodiversity. How does it change in space and in time? We also look at what we call ecosystem functions and services. So how does soil biodiversity do things like support plant growth, filter water, store carbon from the atmosphere, and regulate climate? These are all really important functions that soil biodiversity does. Chapter 5 takes a look at things that threaten soil biodiversity, so things like erosion, land use change, that sort of thing. And then we look at interventions, ways that we can actually protect soil biodiversity and encourage it to do all these things that help us as people as well as our other living organisms on Earth. And then Chapter 7 looks more specifically at policy, education, and outreach. We do have some additional education materials for teachers in classrooms if you want to look into them, and then some kind of conclusions and take-homes. So if you're a student and your teacher has asked you to write an essay for class about soil biodiversity, your teacher might insist that you have to be able to cite a source where you've learned all this information. And the really cool thing about this atlas is that it is written by scientists and can be cited as a primary resource. So the citation is here on the website. You can also find it in the book and in other locations. So if you do use information from this website or from the book, just use this to tell people where you learned about it. All right, I'm going to real quick check and see if I have any questions before there we go, I jump into the next stage. Okay. Do humans serve as a threat to soil? Yes, actually, humans are really the primary threat to soils. We are really good at manipulating our landscape and our area to benefit ourselves. This includes building houses in cities and communities. This includes protecting land from flooding or using resources like a dam to generate particular water flows. Agricultural disturbance, where we learn to till the ground so that we create conditions that really support food crops. All of those are ways that humans modify the soil. And there's some major benefits to these things. We all need soil, but it's also true that this really changes the soil habitat. And we know that it actually disturbs a lot of soil life and it can decrease a lot of soil life. And so something that is really important for us to think about is how can we think about the soil organisms that are there and manage these systems that maybe it's not quite so disruptive to the soil organisms, but that can still provide the things that we need that are very important, like food. So I'm going to move into our diversity of soil organisms chapter. And the reason I'm excited to share this with you all today is because I've been working on it very hard the past couple of weeks. And we now have this nice overview online of the chapter. If you want, you can download a PDF of just chapter 2. And as of yesterday, you all are the first people to see this. We now have specific pages for all of the taxa found in soils. And so today I'm going to let you all walk me through these and take a look at some of the cool things that we're interested in. So this will hopefully, if you want to learn about one or two of these, this will be a quicker way to do it than working through our 176-page book. So I'm going to real quick check because I'm going to have a question for you all. And that question is, what are some of your favorite organisms that you know live in the soil? Tardigrades, worms, fungi, great, yeah. Slugs, yay. Okay, well, keep them coming. I'm going to go ahead. Let's start with tardigrades, see what we can find out about tardigrades. Go to pop this open for you. My apologies if this gets annoying. I'm just trying to keep track on the chat as well. So what are tardigrades? Clearly some of you know and already love these adorable little critters. So they're animals. They have 8 little legs and these little claws. Commonly they're often called water bears or moss piglets. And they're incredibly tough. They live in harsh environments as well as in our backyards. You can find them in Antarctica, you can find them near volcanoes, and they primarily eat bacteria and plants, or they can prey on other microscopic animals. So this is a nice overview of tardigrades, but if you wanted to dig even deeper and learn some more, what we have here is we pulled out just the page from the atlas that focuses on tardigrades. And so here you can learn lots more information about how tardigrades look, when they were first discovered, 1773. You can learn about how they're related to other organisms, their taxonomy. You can learn about where they live, as well as their diversity and where they're found. And then we have a bunch more pictures of these little guys under a microscope. So all that information is right there for you to learn. Okay, so I think the next one that we had was worms, and that's a really exciting answer. I'm really glad you mentioned it. So There's actually a lot of different kinds of worms in soil. So earthworms are what we primarily think of. These are those big pink kind of ringed slimy things that come out of the ground, especially when it's raining. And earthworms are super important soil organisms. They burrow into the soil, so they open up spaces for water and air to flow through it. They eat a lot of dead plant material, so they prevent litter from building up on the soil surface. And they can live in soil in a couple of different ways. There's earthworms that live just on the surface. There's earthworms that kind of make these burrows where they come up at night and grab dead plant leaves and then burrow back down into the soil during the day. And then there's earthworms that spend all their time completely underground, eating soil actually more so than the actual litter. And so again here, you can click on that link and learn more about the earthworms in details just from the atlas. But what I really wanted to talk about is when we say worm, there's actually a handful of other organisms that aren't earthworms. They're not related to the oligochaetes, which are the true earthworms, but sometimes they get called worms. So that includes things like nematodes, which are commonly called roundworms. And these are microscopic. You have to have a microscope to see them. But they're one of the most diverse and abundant groups of animals on the planet. And they eat all kinds of stuff. They can eat living plants, they can eat dead plants, they can eat bacteria and fungi, and they can also prey on other nematodes. So there's a lot of really cool stuff about nematodes. And another kind of worm that you might see in the soil are called inkytraeads. I'll ask if anyone's heard of inkytraeads, and then I'll talk about them, and I'll see if anyone has heard of them. These are often called potworms, and they're closely related to what we consider earthworms. They're in the same phylum, Annelida, but they're a little bit smaller. They tend to live in cold, wet, organic, rich habitats, so places like peat bogs or moorlands. And they're actually really important in those habitats. They eat a lot of dead plant material and bacteria and fungi. They're mostly transparent, so as opposed to earthworms, they're almost always clear. Let me try and get that picture a little bigger for you all. There we go. There's a good inkytraead. But you can still see them with the naked eye if you're looking for them. Sometimes you can find inkytraeads in potted plants, maybe out on your front porch. That's where they kind of get the word, the name potworms from. So I'm going to real quick bop back and take a look at the chat, see what other questions we have. There we go. Ants. Slugs, ants. All right. What can you tell us about jumping worms? I hear they are invasive here in the Midwest. So that's a great question. I've not heard the term jumping worms before, so I'm not 100% sure what you mean. But actually in the Midwest, most of the earthworms we see are invasive. Back in the last ice age, the glaciers came very far south down on the North American continent, and they covered areas like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the northern part of Illinois, and into the northeast of the U.S. And in Canada as well. And that period of glacial cover actually wiped out any earthworms that had been there previously. And in the 10,000 years since those glaciers retreated, there weren't any earthworms in those parts of North America. And in fact, the earthworms that we see there now largely came over with Europeans, often in ship ballasts. So to balance the weight of the ship in the ocean, they'd often put soil in the bottom of the ship, and then they'd often just dump it when they landed. And so these earthworms, which are common in Europe, started crawling through the forests of North America. And in fact, the forests of North America likely looked very different before Europeans arrived because there wasn't nearly as much litter decomposition. And there's been a lot of scientific work in Canada and in North America that shows these earthworms that aren't native to North America can accelerate litter decomposition and change things dramatically for ecosystems. So yes, earthworms are actually largely invasive in parts of North America. In the southern parts of North America, there are many invasive in parts of North America. In the southern parts of North America, there are many native earthworms that were there and part of the system. It's really only the northern part of North America where the glaciers were, but that's true. Are tardigrades also named water bears? Yes. Water bears are a common name for tardigrades, yes. And some people will also call tardigrades moss piglets, which is another great common name. So coming back to some of the other favorites that people mentioned, let's take a look at fungi, and then let's take a look at slugs. So we're going to go this way to find our slugs. Oh, sorry, fungi. I said fungi first, then we'll go do slugs. Here's fungi. So, question for you all. Fungi, plant or animal? No. We have a vote for plant. Any other votes on fungi before we answer the question? Neither. Yes. Neither is correct. Fungi are a kingdom all to themselves, if we're thinking about biological organization. So they're not plants and they're not animals, but they are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. They don't actually, there's a lot of reasons they're not very similar to plants. They can't do photosynthesis. They have very different cell wall structures. And fungi primarily eat dead things, dead plants, dead animals, that sort of thing. And fungi are actually really cool because they encompass a lot of different sizes. So some fungi, like yeasts that we might use to bake bread, are actually only a single cell, so they're very, very tiny. And some fungi are, they may have very small body structures. But then there's other fungi that are enormous. We think about the mushrooms and the earth stars that we see out in the woods. But these are often just only a small part of the whole organism. Fungi have these wide networks of mycelia underground. And in fact, the largest organism on Earth is a fungus. It covers about 6.5 square kilometers of a forest in Washington, I believe. So they can be giant and they can be tiny, and they're really important because they do a lot of different things. They decompose wood, for instance, particularly a component of wood called lignin. There's very few organisms on Earth that can decompose lignin, and fungi are the real powerhouses on that trait. We also, I'm going to real quickly just pop this open to talk a little bit more about some other aspects of fungi. As you can see, there's bioluminescent fungi, fungi that glow in the dark in the tropics. And we have a bunch of fungi that are what we call mycorrhizal fungi. So these are fungi that produce associations with plants. They actually live within the plant cells. So we can see here, these big blue dots are all fungal structures, parts of the fungal body. And then you can kind of see these little hyphae radiating out from the root. And so what these fungi do is they explore the soil and pick up nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and water and bring it back to the plant root. In exchange, the plant will give this fungus carbon or sugar energy that it makes during photosynthesis. So the fungus can get its energy from the plant and also pick up extra nutrients to give back to the plant. And over 80% of all plants have a relationship with a mycorrhizal fungus. So they're hugely important in the plant world and everything that the plant world supports. And I'm going to mention one more thing before we move on past fungi, and that's that there's two different kinds of mycorrhizae. There's these mycorrhizae that live within the plant cells and produce these structures that look like trees. And these are called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. It's that arbol, if you think of Arbor Day, that means tree. It's the same root for this tree-like structure. And then the other kind are called ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they form these little sheaths around the root, but they don't actually go into the root cell. So ecto means outside or on top of, and that's these guys. So they're different kinds, and it's a super cool thing. If you want to learn more about that, I recommend looking it up. Okay, slugs. We promised slugs. So slugs and snails, this picture is actually snails. Technically, they live on the surface of soil, but they're really important to soil food webs. They can eat dead plant material. They can eat fungi like these guys are doing. They can be really important. So we have some information about slugs as well as all these other kinds of organisms like spiders, scorpions, and bees that may live on the surface or have little burrows in the soil, but that primarily eat their food above ground. So those are really important too. So kudos for keeping track of that. All right, I'm just checking on my questions here. There is research that is done that water bears are the toughest animals and survive depths of space. Do you study them as well? So yes, water bears have gone to space and they have not died. Water bears, my boss here at Colorado State works in Antarctica. She has brought soils back from Antarctica and left them frozen for years, and then bring a little water, put them in a little bit of water, and the water bears wake up and go to town eating just like they're normal. So yes, I've done a little bit of tardigrade water bear research. My colleagues are primarily, that's their focus. My personal area of interest is a little more fungi and bacteria, but I've seen them under the microscope. Our lab has several of them. So really good question. It's also true, there's a lot of soil organisms that are super tough. Nematodes are another one. They've actually sent nematodes into space, and they've also not died. They've been just fine. That one gets a little less press, but yeah, soil organisms are tough. All right, so let me see here. What else were we going to take a look at? Ants. Ants. Let's look at ants. And if anybody has a favorite organism that they really want to look at, go ahead and type it up. Sorry, team. I'm being slow. Ants. So ants are super cool. They're social insects. There's actually several social insects that live in soil. And ants are really important in a variety of ways because they move soil around a lot. Many ants build these extensive mounds and nest networks below ground and extending above ground. So they move soil around a lot. So sometimes they get called ecosystem engineers. They can open up space in the soil that allows water and air to flow through it differently. They may create clogs in the soil that prevent air and water from moving through it. A lot of ants will collect plant material or prey on other organisms. A lot of ants are predators, actually. And some ants will do some farming. So in this picture here, these are actually little baby aphids, little aphid insects, and these ants are basically farming these insects, giving them conditions to grow really well, and then the ants eat the aphids. So ants are important contributors to how things live below ground. And there's about 14,000 species of ants all around the world, so quite a few of those. All right, let me check our time. Oh, we're doing good. All right, is there anything else that people want to check out real quick while at hand? Oh, okay. So we have another question about fungi. How it falls into its own kingdom, but how else might it be more classified? So that's a really good question. So at the kingdom level, all the fungi kind of come out together, and then there's several phylums within that kingdom. So the here, I'll pop up a pretty picture for you so while I talk about this. So there are several phylums in the kingdom of fungus. So the biggest ones are called Basidiomycota, and that's all the mushrooms that we think about. So this purple thing and this bioluminescent thing, these are Basidiomycota, and they form the classic mushroom. They often have gills. They produce spores in a particular way. And that's a pretty big group of fungi and very diverse. Another big phylum of fungi is called the Ascomycota. And those are things like these cup fungi. So it's a fungus, but it's not producing this mushroom shape. This is an Ascomycota. They also, all the fungi produce spores, but they produce spores kind of along this cup structure. And they don't disperse out of gills the way the mushrooms do. And this is a big picture view. You can take a whole semester course on fungi, and I recommend it if you have the chance. But Ascomycota is another big phylum. And then within that phylum, there are many different classes, orders, and families. The other phylum of fungi include the Glomeromycota. Those are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that I talked about earlier that form those structures within plant roots. All of those fungi fall into a single phylum called the Glomeromycota. This is important because the ectomycorrhizae I talked about that just make the sheaths on the outside of the roots, those are largely Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. They're not what we call a monophyletic lineage. That means that the ability for the fungus to form those structures has evolved multiple times across different lineages. It's not a characteristic that all the fungi developed as they evolved together. It's one that's independently evolved multiple times, whereas that internal arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal system or structure, that evolved once, and all the Glomeromycota have evolved with that setup. There are also a group that we call the Zygomycota. It's a little bit of a catch-all group. This includes a lot of what we call sugar molds. So this is like the stuff that grows on the food in the back of your refrigerator, the white fuzzy stuff. Sometimes they have little black caps on them, or it's gray or kind of greenish. A lot of that stuff is Zygomycota, and that's another phylum. Things like penicillium, where we get penicillium, are in the Zygomycota. And then there's another phylum called Chytridiomycota, and these are called water fungi, and they're mostly aquatic. They live in streams and lakes and rivers and sometimes even the ocean. And they tend to be maybe 1 or 2 cells. They're very tiny. You have to have a microscope to see them. And they pretty much live free-floating in water, so they don't live on land the way we often think about fungi. So those are kind of the big phylums of fungi, and then within there you can get a lot more detail about the classes and the orders and the families. So hopefully that answers that question. All right, what else do we have? What is my favorite soil animal? This is great. So I'm going to answer this question. I'm going to transition back to the PowerPoint slides, so I hopefully don't bother you flipping back and forth quite so much. But please check out this website. Look at the atlas. 150 scientists worked for 3 years to put this together so you all can enjoy it. So please do so and explore on your own time. And if you have any questions, I'll give you my contact info at the end. This is where you can find the website. So my favorite soil animal, that's a really good way to phrase it because it means I can't say fungi. My favorite soil animal, actually it might be Columbella, and we didn't talk about Columbella, so I lied. I'm gonna show you a Columbella before I pop back here. So Columbella are these little animals. They're called hexapods. So they're a type of arthropod, but they're not true insects. They don't have the wings and the other things that make true insects. They're commonly called springtails. And they're pretty much just adorable. So this is a Columbella. This little purple guy up here is also a Columbella. And I'm going to go ahead and open this and see if I can show you. What's really cool is they have this structure on their abdomen. Here we go. This structure here that they can put down on the ground and basically lever themselves or spring themselves meters away, and that's kind of how they move long distances. They can also walk at a slow pace. So let me see if there's a good picture. They're just incredibly diverse. So there's these like really cute little round ones, and there's these long kind of chubby ones, and some of them are super hairy, and some of them have really clear segments. But the cool thing that they all do is they can put this little appendage down and fling themselves across soil in a really cool way. I could send this link around. There's some folks have put together some really interesting claymation videos of springtails. So if you're ever wanting to check that out on YouTube, that's another great option. I'm not going to take the time it would take to pull it up right now here, but that's probably my favorite. All right. So now we're going to go back to slides. So that's kind of an introduction to the atlas and the overview. And it looks like we have about 10 or 15 minutes or so left in this class period. So I want to open the floor to you for more questions if you want to know anything else, or if there was something else you want to see or learn about that I didn't spend some time on, please let me know. I'm just going to this has all my contact information. So if you or your teacher want to ask me more questions, I tend to always think of great questions about 2 hours after a presentation, so feel free to reach out. You can also look up our Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. The contact information is here. And we have a blog that we try to write up some of the latest research. And there was some really cool research out just a couple weeks ago about these springtails, the Columbella. And it was about how Columbella respond to climate change and invasive Columbella. And it's a really cool paper. You can see that on the blog. Okay, so I've heard recently they're talking about soil being a solution to carbon dioxide and global warming. Yes, there's been a lot of discussion about that, and it's really exciting. So soil is actually the third largest pool or kind of storage box of carbon on Earth. Number 1 and number 2 are limestone rocks in the ocean. So soils actually have a tremendous amount of carbon in them, way more than the atmosphere does. So it's a really important pool for us to understand how does carbon get into the soil pool, as well as how does carbon leave that soil pool. So there's kind of two angles to think about this. And so one angle is to think about are there ways that we could manage soil to increase the amount of carbon that it stores? And basically the principle there is plants, through photosynthesis, suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they turn it into plant parts like leaves and stems and roots and that sort of thing. And then soil organisms eat those dead plant parts when they die. And so thinking about how those organisms eat, how much they eat, how fast they eat, where they eat it, can make a really big difference on what happens to it. So when a soil animal or a microorganism eats this dead plant thing, just like us, they respire, so oxygen in, CO2 out. So some of that carbon energy that the plant turned into plant material is respired off by soil animals and organisms, and it goes back to the atmosphere. It's just a loop. But some of that dead plant material and even dead animal material, and particularly dead soil animal material, can get stuck in the soil, and that's the source of how soils get all their carbon. So there's a lot of people, including myself, researching how does this happen, and how could we manage systems to get more carbon stuck in the soil. And there's some promising avenues. We know things like restoring degraded ecosystems or planting perennial vegetation can increase carbon in soils. We know that kind of protecting soil organisms, not disturbing, not tilling as much, can be a way to kind of help do that. But it's still very much an active area of research to understand how much we can really do that. There's some promising avenues, but we're not sure yet if soils could suck up enough carbon to make a big difference in our atmospheric carbon budget. So it's probably not a silver bullet solution. It's not the only solution, but it is certainly a solution, and it's a very, what I call, low risk climate solution. There's not a lot of harm that comes from putting more carbon in soil through things like plants and decomposition. So hopefully that answers that question. Next question, what inspired you to know more about soils? That's a really good question. So as a kid, I, like most kids, loved going outside and playing in the dirt, and my cousins and I made little mud pies and soil soup kinds of things all the time, and we'd come back dirty, and my grandmother would get mad, and it was just this delightful cycle. My grandmother would get mad, and it was just this delightful cycle. And as I got older, I got more and more interested in, honestly, chemistry. And when I went to college, I wanted to major in chemistry. And I started out there, and I really loved thinking about how molecules were reacting and interacting and that sort of thing, but I was a little bit bored by just benchtop chemistry, mixing things together to get different scents or colors or different that sort of thing. And I kind of stumbled into this world of soils, and what I discovered is it was all the chemical reactions that I was super excited about from my chemistry lectures, but it's literally what makes life on Earth continue. It's breaking down dead nutrients, dead energy, dead material, and turning it into forms that living organisms can use, and sending those nutrients and that energy back up these food webs to the plants and to the grazing mammals and the birds and the reptiles and all these things. And so that's where I really got hooked on soils. It was super cool to think about, and it's literally what makes life happen on Earth and persist on Earth. how many continents have you studied soil from? So that's a really good question. My own personal research has primarily been in North America and primarily in the Midwest. I'm originally from Iowa. I've worked in Illinois, so mostly in the Midwest. I really truly love that landscape, and that's where I do a lot of work. But I work with a group of scientists here in Colorado who work in Antarctica, as I mentioned. I've personally never been to Antarctica, but my colleagues have been. They go every year. I have also, I've worked with collaborators that sample soil in Europe and Australia, but I haven't gone to collect in those countries. That's been a situation where they've analyzed their soils and we've analyzed our soils and kind of put the data together. I do get to travel quite a bit in my job because I work with scientists everywhere. So in the past year, I've been to Germany and to China, as well as several places in North America to talk about science and to meet with scientists to collaborate with data and learn new things, including an intensive group of earthworm experts. That was a really fun workshop to go to. So I'm a lucky person. Oh, so do different colored soils have different microflora? That's a really great question. And it's kind of a mixed answer. Different colored soils often do have different sorts of microorganisms and different sorts of communities, but it's not quite as clear-cut as that. There's a lot of microorganisms that can live in lots of different kinds of soils, so they're something that we consider to be pretty common, and you might find those in a soil that's pretty red or pretty black or pretty green or pretty blue. But there's some organisms that are going to be a little bit more specific, and this is a case where they're not necessarily responding to the color per se. The color usually reflects some sort of difference in the nutrients and what we call the mineralogy. So a really red soil has a lot of iron oxidized in it, and so that's what makes them red. And so the kinds of organisms that thrive in those soils often have a metabolism that's adapted to those conditions. We often call those very reduced conditions because it means the iron has already been oxidized, so there's less charges for them to work with. That's getting down a deep bunny hole, but whereas soils that may be very dark brown or black, they have a lot of organic matter in them. That's what kind of makes them that really dark color. So you get different kinds of organisms that can break down really complicated organic molecules in those kinds of soils. So that's kind of a highlight on that. And often you'll see the colors of soils really often correlate with climate in a lot of ways, and that climate can make a really big difference in what sorts of organisms live in the soil as well. All right. So I see we have 5 minutes left. Looks like we have one more question. How good or bad are fertilizers for soil? That's a really good question. And there's kind of two important things going on in that question. And fertilizers are a way for us to add nutrients to a soil, usually because we want to grow something specific. Maybe that's corn, maybe it's tomatoes, maybe it's flowers in a garden. And we know that these plants need these nutrients to grow, and that if you give them more of those nutrients to an extent, they'll grow more. And so when we think about things like how do we produce enough food to feed our communities and our world, thinking about making sure those crop plants have enough nutrients is really, really important. What's also important to recognize is that fertilizers help plants grow up to a certain point. There's a point where if you add more fertilizer, it doesn't actually help the plant grow anymore. And in fact, once you pass these points, a lot of that fertilizer leaves the soil and winds up in streams and lakes and oceans, where all these little aquatic organisms are going to use it up and grow, and you get algae and you get things like toxic cyanobacteria. And then as these other things keep growing really fast, they're using up all the dissolved oxygen in the waterways. And so in water, oxygen is a really limited resource, and what happens is it basically ends up suffocating other aquatic organisms like fish. And so that's where we get these like dead zones or hypoxia that we hear about, like the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, or white like swimming beaches at lakes and stuff might be closed during the summer. And so it's important. So the point is, it's hard to say. It's not really a good or bad situation. There are conditions where adding fertilizer can have benefits, like promoting food production, but there's also situations where fertilizers can have major negative effects. And so it's really important for us to learn where those kind of what we call thresholds are, so that farmers aren't using or buying fertilizers that aren't helping them grow their crops. But it's also having some fertilizer can be a really helpful thing in a lot of situations, particularly in areas that struggle to produce enough. So that's a really long answer, I know, and the frustrating truth is it's not really a good or bad situation, but it's very dependent on what's going on. And there's places where it has a lot of benefits, and there's also some negative consequences as well. So I think we're just about up on time, so I'm going to kind of wrap up here. Like I said, if you have any questions or you want to follow up, you can contact me, as I mentioned here. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day and a good weekend. Thanks for listening.